This is part 2 of the ICJR form training, and we are picking up with section E, the criminal justice system section. Note that there are multiple questions in the criminal justice section that have been updated to reflect the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. So here are a few tips before we jump into the criminal justice sections of the form. If your ICJR grant is funding criminal justice activities, you're going to be reporting on your agency-wide data for the law enforcement section, the prosecution section, the court section, and also the probation and parole section. So what does agency-wide mean? Well, let's use where I'm from as an example, the city of Portland, Maine. Let's say that the funds being used are for a prosecutor's office in the city of Portland. And agency-wide data is not going to mean that I'm going to report on the whole entire city of Portland's prosecution numbers. Instead, I'm going to report on the specific unit within the agency that is using grant funds for activity. So for instance, if my ICJR funding for the city of Portland is going to the prosecuting domestic violence misdemeanor cases, I'm only going to be reporting on domestic violence misdemeanor cases reported and prosecuted in the city of Portland or referred to the prosecutor's office in the city of Portland. If there are 3 people in the office that are prosecuting misdemeanor DVs and work specifically on that, you'll be reporting for all 3 of those people, even if only one of those prosecutors is funded by the grant. That is what we mean by agency-wide data for the purposes of this form. If your law enforcement office houses a specialized unit that is specifically grant funded to investigate DV crimes or sexual assault crimes, then you'll be reporting on that whole entire specialized unit's activities. So that's what we mean by agency-wide or jurisdictional unit for the purposes of this form. If you're having any problems determining what your agency-wide data would be, please feel free to reach out to your program specialist at OBW. The first section in the criminal justice section is section E1, law enforcement. If your ICJR program funds were used to support law enforcement activities, check yes and answer questions 36 through 39. We would expect you to report some law enforcement officer FTEs in the staff section of the form if you are completing section E1. If your ICJR program funds were not used for law enforcement, then check no and skip on to section E2. If you have an ICJR grant-funded advocate employed in a law enforcement office, you will not be reporting their data here, but instead that advocate's grant-funded activities should be captured in section D, victim services. For question 36, report the number of law enforcement activities relating to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and or stalking cases or incidents for the current reporting period. Each incident is one case and may involve one or more offenses and or one or more victims. Each case incident may also involve one or more offenders. If an activity related to a case or incident involving more than one type of crime, then that activity should be counted only once under the primary victimization. Report calls for assistance, incident reports, and cases investigated, arrests of predominant aggressor, and referrals to prosecutor. The number reported under calls for assistance, incident reports, and cases investigated should all be very, very similar. Only use the protection orders issued category if law enforcement has the authority to issue protection orders in your jurisdiction. For question 37, report the total number of victims and survivor referrals made to victim services, whether that's governmental and non-governmental. These referral numbers are not unduplicated since a victim or survivor could receive a referral to both. Note that there is a difference between governmental and non-governmental victim services. Governmental refers to victim services provided by victim assistance or victim witness specialist coordinators employed by criminal justice agencies, such as law enforcement, prosecution, courts, or probation, that are targeted to victims and survivors of DV, dating violence, sexual assault, and or stalking. Non-governmental refers to services provided by a nonprofit community-based agency to victims and survivors of the four crimes. For question 38, complete this question only if law enforcement officers assisted with protection orders. An example of this would be if a law enforcement officer helped a victim with the paperwork to file for a protection order. Specify whether protection orders, temporary or final, for which victims received assistance from grant-funded law enforcement personnel were for domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Typically, if a grantee reports the number of protection orders requested, we expect to see data reported on the number granted and vice versa. If you are not able to provide completed data, include a note in question 39 under the additional information. Question 39 is for that additional information for the law enforcement section. It's optional, but here you may discuss the effectiveness of law enforcement activities funded or supported by ICJR program grant funds and any additional information you would like to share about these activities beyond what you have provided in the data. Next is section E2, prosecution. If your ICJR program funds were used for prosecution, check yes and answer questions 40 through 46. If your ICJR program funds were not used for prosecution, then check no and skip on to section E3. Before we really go into the prosecution section, it's really helpful for us to go over a few definitions. In the prosecution section, you're going to be reporting on cases. And what we mean by a case is that a case is usually related to one incident, one victim, or one offender. Sometimes that can change, but basically a case is a case, and for the purposes of this form, you're not being asked to report on each charge within a case. Cases should be reported as a domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, regardless of what the actual charge is. So this is a judgment call. If there is a misdemeanor harassment charge, you need to determine which victimization that case is addressing, such as if it was due to a stalking incident or a domestic violence incident. Because you're reporting a case here in the prosecution section, it must fall under the language of, it must fall under one of those categories of the crime, even if the charge itself does not contain language such as domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking within the statute. So you're still going to be characterizing it as one of those offenses under a certain victimization, however it best fits. Another example is if you have an incident that involves harassment, vandalism, and also an assault, and those were the charges under the case, you would count that as one case because it's one incident with multiple charges. So just remember that you're going to be reporting on cases, and when you're reporting on the case, you're going to be characterizing it by the most serious offense. So with that, we're going to start reviewing the prosecution section of the form. So in question 40A, the number of cases received, accepted, declined, or transferred. Report the number of cases received, the number of cases accepted for prosecution, the number of cases declined, and the number of cases transferred to a higher or lower court outside grant-funded jurisdiction, and the number of cases that were referred for federal prosecution. All data reported in the prosecution section is based on cases rather than charges. Cases received should be based on cases received from law enforcement. So some jurisdictions receive referrals from other sources, and you can include those referrals if you have that information. The numbers reported in 40B, C, and D should be based on the number reported in 40A. The exception would be if a case referral was received during the previous reporting period and no decision was made until this current reporting period. For any cases reported as declined in 40A, Part C, report the reasons declined in the following question, 40B. For question 41, report the dispositions of those cases resolved during the current reporting period by type of case and disposition. If a case is not resolved yet, then you do not need to report anything. For example, if a defendant is charged with a Class A felony. So if this case, if the Class A felony is pled to or is convicted of a Class A felony, then you would report that as pled as or guilty as charged. If it is pled to or convicted of a Class B felony, then you would instead report it as pled to a lesser charge or found guilty of a lesser charge within the same category. If this defendant of a Class A felony pleads to or is convicted of a Class B misdemeanor, then you're going to report that as pled to a lesser charge or found guilty of a lesser charge in a lower category. For question 42, this is an optional additional narrative question. Here you can discuss other issues, the extent to which cases that were characterized as domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking also included additional charges or elements. So any additional information here to relate back to what you reported in the previous questions of the prosecution section. For question 43, if you are a tribal agency or government, report the number of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking cases that were referred to state or federal prosecutors for prosecution during the current reporting period. For question 44, report the number of victims or survivors you have referred to victim services, both governmental and non-governmental. These numbers are not unduplicated so that if a victim or survivor receives a referral to both, then you can count that in both categories. This is asking for the number of referrals and not the number of victims. For question 45, report the number of protection orders, temporary and final, for which victims or survivors received assistance from grant-funded prosecution personnel, where for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And you should answer this question only if ICJR grant-funded prosecutors assisted with the protection orders. Typically, for grantee reports the number of protection orders requested, we do expect to see a number reported as granted or vice versa. And then in question 46, we have an optional additional narrative question. You may discuss the effectiveness of your prosecution activities funded or supported by your ICJR program grant. And you may also provide additional information that you would like to share about those activities beyond what the data can tell us numerically, so giving a story to those numbers. Next is section E3, courts. If your ICJR program funds were used for courts, check yes and answer questions 47 through 53. If your ICJR program funds were not used for courts, then check no and skip on to section E4. For this section, the same tips apply as previously mentioned, but you will be reporting information for the entire grant-funded unit. So if grant funds go to a specialized DV court, you will be reporting on all the activities of that domestic violence court. And if grant funds are assisting or funding an advocate or an assistant who works within the court to help victims throughout this process, you're going to be reporting those activities in the Victim Services section. So all data reported by court subgrantees is based on cases rather than charges. In question 47, the disposition of criminal cases, report the disposition of SA, DV, and stalking cases resolved during the current reporting period, including dismissals, deferred adjudications, convictions, and acquittals. In question 48, judicial monitoring, if funds were used for judicial monitoring, you would report the number of offenders reviewing or reviewed during the current reporting period and the total number of hearings. In question 49, disposition of violations, report the number of cases reviewed by the court in which there were dispositions of violations. Only report when there was a final adjudication of the violation. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. So note to reflect VAWA 2013 reauthorization updates, partial or full revocation is now one category. In question 50, report the number of victims or survivors that court personnel have referred to victim services, both governmental and non-governmental. These numbers are not unduplicated so that if a victim or survivor is referred to victim services several times during the reporting period, you can count the number of referrals and not the numbers of victim or survivors. For question 51, specify whether civil protection orders issued by the court were for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking. You should report the total number of temporary and final civil protection orders requested and granted by the court. For question 52, criminal protection orders, report the number of criminal protection orders requested and granted by the court during the 6-month reporting period. Question 53 is an optional additional narrative question, and here you may discuss the effectiveness of court activities funded or supported by your ICJR program grant, and you might also choose to provide additional information that you would like to share about those activities that the data itself in numerical form can't tell, so giving those numbers a story. Next is section E4, probation and parole. If your ICJR program funds were used for probation and parole, check yes and answer questions 54 through 58. And if your ICJR program funds were not used for probation or parole, check no and skip on to section E5. In question 54, in the first column, report the total number of offenders for DV, sexual assault, stalking. In the second and third columns, report the number of offenders who completed probation without violations and the number completing probation with violations. The total number completing probation, both with and without violations, should not be higher than the total number of offenders. For question 55, report monitoring activities by probation and parole funded staff. The first column identifies the type of contact. The second column identifies the number of offenders or victims or survivors. And the third column identifies the total number of contacts. In question 56, dispositions of violations, report the number of DV, SA, stalking cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. The violation does not need to occur during the current reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. In question 57, report the number of victim or survivor referred to victim services, governmental and non-governmental, by grant-funded probation and parole staff. Question 58 is an optional additional narrative question for you to highlight or extend on any of the information that you've reported in the probation and parole section. Next is section E5, Batterer Intervention Programs. If your ICJR program funds were used for batterer intervention programs, check yes and answer questions 59 through 61. And if they were not, if your funds were not used for batterer intervention programs, check no and skip on to section F. In question 59, report the number of offenders in your grant-funded batterer intervention programs during the current reporting period. In question 60, report the outcomes for the offenders who completed the BIP program, who were terminated from the program, or who were returned to the program after termination during the current reporting period. Termination can be by the program or by the offender, and if you need to use the other category, please be very specific. For question 61, length of BIP in weeks, report the number of weeks that batterers are expected to remain in the program in order to complete it. If your batterer intervention program has more than one program length and or curriculum, provide the length for each type of program supported with grant funds. Next is section F, community measures. All grantees must complete this section. It is mandatory. In question 62, report the total number of requests received for temporary and final protection orders and the total number of granted in the grant jurisdiction during the reporting period. You should only include civil protection orders here. If the data submitted is not jurisdiction-wide data, or you're not able to collect this data, include an explanation in question 63. So in question 63, exceptions, this section will be monitored by your OBW program manager. If you are not able to provide complete data here, or any data, you should indicate whether a plan has been developed to collect this data. If your jurisdiction is a town and this data is collected on a county level, report the county-wide data and include an explanation of this in this question 63. Next is section G, narrative. All grantees must answer question 64. For this question, report on the status of all of your ICJR program grant goals and objectives as of the end of the current reporting period. Report only on the status of your approved goals and objectives. You should refer to your approved grant proposal and project narrative, the what will be done section, if you are not sure of your grant program's goals and objectives. All of these must be reported in each reporting period, and your OBW program manager will pay close attention to this question. This question enables them to monitor the status of your goals and objectives. Indicate whether the activities related to your objectives for the reporting period have been completed, are in progress, are delayed, or have been revised. You should include any additional information that you think your OBW program manager needs to know to understand what you have done and what you have accomplished or have not accomplished. Comment on your success and challenges. If you have not completed objectives that should have been completed during the reporting period, you must provide an explanation. All grantees must answer the questions 65 and 66 on the January to June report, and that is the report that is always submitted on July 30th annually. For question 65, what do you see as the most significant areas of remaining need with regard to improving services to victims and survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking? You should report not only on the needs of your program, but needs within the community, needs of the victims and survivors, underserved populations, challenges, and barriers. These needs do not need to be related to the scope of your grant program. So consider the geographic regions, underserved populations, service delivery systems, types of victims and survivors, and challenges and barriers unique to your state or service area. When answering question 66, what has the ICJR program funding allowed you to do that you could not do prior to receiving this funding? Please be as specific as you can. If you have any information about what it was like before receiving ICJR program funds, you can compare with the results that occurred after receiving the ICJR funding. We'd really like to know about it. We can use these stories and statistics that you can provide when we write our reports for OBW, so you can tell us why these funds are making a difference to you, your clients, and your community. Questions 67 and 68 are optional but encouraged. So for question 67, provide additional information regarding the effectiveness of your grant-funded program. Talk about the difference it has made in your job, in your community, in the lives of the people that you serve, and in making legal services more available to serve victims and survivors. Discuss what you think are the key parts of your program's effectiveness. If you feel that a certain aspect of your program's effectiveness is the result of ICJR program funds, even if it was not actually supported with grant funds, you can discuss it in this question. For question 68, provide any additional information that you would like us to know about the data submitted. If there were any issues or irregularities in the data that you reported in previous sections of the form, provide an explanation here that will help us understand that data. So for example, if your computer crashed and you lost data, or if a person that you hired left during the current reporting period, you could not provide certain data, here is the place for you to outline that. So once the form is completed, you must go to the last page of the form and click the Validate button. The validation process will highlight any missing or incomplete information and ask whether you wish to return to the section to review or change the data. So when this happens, you may see one of a few warning messages. One type is a validation error message, the one with the red X. If you receive this type of message, it means you are missing some of the required information. If you want to fix this error now, you will click Yes, and it will bring you back to the exact question on the form. If not, you can click No and continue on with validation. However, you will not be able to complete the validation process until you fix a validation error. The second type of warning is a reminder and has a yellow exclamation point. This type of message indicates that something on the form looks like it may be incorrect. You do not have to make a correction to the form to successfully validate when you get this message. But if you want to review the information, you click Yes, and it will bring you back to the exact question on the form. If not, click No, and you can continue on with validation. After correcting or completing missing information, return to the bottom of the form and press Validate again until all sections of the form are complete, and you receive a third type of warning message, which is actually not a warning, but instead it's a validation success message. And at this point, your form has been successfully validated and it's ready for you to submit through GMS. Thank you for tuning in to our recorded training for the ICJR reporting form. These are resources available to you through our website, vawamei.org. You can watch this closed caption recording of the entire progress reporting form, section by section. There are training materials that you can download, sample progress reporting forms and instructions that you can download. There are FAQs that you can access, and you can also view ICJR summary data reports, which are aggregated grantee data, and they include charts and tables. You can view all of that right on our website. If you have any questions as you are filling out the reporting form, please feel free to call or email VAWA MEI or your program specialist or GMS. So our phone number is right on the screen. It's 1-800-922-8292. Or you can reach out to your program specialist if you have any questions about what you are grant funded to be doing or your goals or objectives. And you can reach out to the GMS for support if you are having difficulties downloading your form from the Grants Management System website. Thank you so much for tuning in, and feel free to reach out with questions anytime.